Olá a todos, obrigado pela presença de todos. Estamos tendo agora, vamos ter hoje o nosso quarto encontro do Ciclo de Encontros Subjetividade e Cultura, organizado por mim e pelo professor Fabio Caprio Leite de Castro, a partir da Escola de Humanidades, da PUC de Porto Alegre, com o apoio do CDEA, né? Um evento ligado à linha de pesquisa capitaneada pelo Fabio de Fenomenologia e Hermenêutica, onde temos buscado convidar pesquisadores e pesquisadores que estejam desenvolvendo estudos concernentes a pensar o nosso próprio tempo. E hoje teremos o imenso prazer de receber Mitchell Atkinson III, e espero que todos possam aproveitar esse encontro. Eu vou passar para o Fábio, que vai apresentar o nosso querido convidado de hoje. Fábio.
Bom, olá a todos e todas. É um prazer receber vocês mais uma vez para esse novo encontro, né, do nosso ciclo de Subjetividade e Cultura, né? Estamos muito felizes, né, de receber o professor pesquisador Mitchell Atkinson, né, 3, e né, eu tive a alegria de encontrar o professor Atkinson nos encontros nas jornadas do Russell Badstager em Leuven, em março deste ano, né? E fiz o convite, né, ao professor Atkinson para que ele participasse dos encontros que o Marcelo e eu estamos organizando e felizmente, com muita alegria, ele aceitou, né? Então, o professor Atkinson, ele, enfim, realizou uma pesquisa, né, no Graduate School for Social Research, né, na Academia Polonesa de Ciências, né? Ele trabalha atualmente com o programa Writing Program, né? Filosofia, em New York University, Abu Dhabi, né? Ele é autor de diversos artigos, né? Entre os quais um artigo sobre, enfim, independência, migração e atitude natural, ou então um outro artigo sobre, bastante interessante também, sobre empatia, né? E uma análise sobre a autoposição em Fichte, por exemplo, né? Então, é realmente um prazer muito grande, né, receber o professor Atkinson, né, aqui no nosso conjunto de encontros. Infelizmente, né, a nossa tradutora, Débora, né, que vai fazer as traduções dos encontros, ela se encontra doente, né, ela está com problema de garganta e não vai poder estar conosco, mas o que nós propusemos então ao professor, e que ele gentilmente aceitou, é de, enquanto ele for fazendo a palestra dele, ele vai projetando para nós o texto da palestra para facilitar, né, o nosso acompanhamento aqui, e depois, como costumamos fazer nos encontros, depois da fala dele, nós vamos ter um tempinho para questões e aí nós vamos poder fazer essas questões pelo chat, né, tanto em inglês quanto em português, podemos traduzi-las sem problema nenhum, e aí o professor responderá para nós. So, we are happy to welcome Professor and Researcher Mitchell Atkinson III. It's an honor for us here to introduce you and to hear from Poland. So thank you very much to accept our invitation. It's a pleasure and an honor for us.
Well, of course, thanks goes just the other way. This is a wonderful opportunity for me. I'd like to thank Fabio and Marcelo and the Escola de Humanidades. I'd also like notes on my pronunciation of previous school name at some point. But I really appreciate the invitation to speak for group. before I launch into the text, I might like to say that about my own approach to philosophy and sociology. I am very much, as we were discussing before the meeting started, I'm very much a hybrid kind of person. And I believe very strongly in hybridity. And I think a kind of hybridity of thinking is somewhat missing today. And generally speaking, academic discourse, but also in specifically in philosophical discourse. So what I'm hoping to do in my work in general is to try and mix as many things as I sort of can, while maintaining a standard and while accepting the lumps that might go with such an approach, the various difficulties. I think this is important because, as you'll see when I go into the text, I do believe that philosophy is important. And I suppose that belief is outdated in a certain sense today. But I think that we as philosophers, people who even care to read, however shallowly, philosophy, have quite a burden because of the various complexities that assault all living persons, anybody with access to, say, the internet. So I'm going to very freely mix philosophical concerns, phenomenological concerns, and sociological concerns in the text that follows. And if some of that seems either confusing or illegitimate, we can talk about it, in the question and answer. So I've shared my screen, and I suppose that everyone can see it. Okay, good. So I'll begin, and you can follow along with me. The questions we face in the 21st century relate most intimately to the ways in which we value human existence. It seems clear that we are entering a phase of socioeconomic life in which production and consumption are not only divorced from notions of general human flourishing, but also from the most fundamental understanding of human perceptual capacity and interest. For quite a long while, we've observed that the movement underlying neoliberal capital is indifferent to eudaimonia for the many. This is obvious to all but the most optimistic of the cheerleaders for the developing social order. What is perhaps less obvious is that there are latent forces of production which, given the right historical conditions, may come to characterize the prevailing economic order and which are indifferent to human being as such. One is guided upon such reflections almost horribly toward the family of panics related to the rise of artificial intelligence and its impact on specific economic indicators like employment. While such reflections and such panics are undoubtedly important, they don't figure prominently in the current work. Rather, what I'm attempting to develop as social theory is an understanding of the kind of invisibility that appears to increasingly characterize our socio-political experience. Now, basically, that opening paragraph is meant to indicate that while what I'm talking about is social phenomena have serious applications to emergent technologies and their effect, I'm not in this text worried about that, even though everybody's worried about it right now. It may not be clear what any of this has to do with phenomenology, especially what is sometimes called classical Husserlian phenomenology. Phenomenological method is famously an approach that favors a close, as it were, microscopic investigation of our moment-to-moment experience. It's not at all clear, given the overall character of much of the chatter surrounding phenomenology and phenomenologists, how such a method is meant to help us make sense of macro-scale social life. As phenomenological philosophers, we can, of course, decide that sociocultural or life is not for us. We can maintain, as I suppose Bertrand Russell maintained at the end of his life, that philosophy has little or perhaps no practical value. I think he took seriously the suggestion that his life would have been better spent as a psychologist, or at least that if he were a young man, when he was in fact an 80-year-old man, he would not study philosophy, he would study psychology. We could think of philosophy as a discipline, not so much useless as finished. We could maintain, as Richard Wood seems to at times, that the questions, many or perhaps all of them, which have traditionally animated philosophers, have been either solved or dissolved. In either case, philosophy becomes either something we abandon altogether or a kind of intellectual onanism, completely divorced from day-to-day concern. Recent work by Chalmers on the ontological status of virtual reality seems to me a case in point, as does a lot of the work applying quasi-psychoanalytic speculation in popular culture. One need not feel compelled to apologize for or defend such philosophical work in the tone of the remarks. Even the most apparently trivial, philosophical exercises have some degree of intellectual value. There is, however, another tradition of philosophy, perhaps even metaphilosophy, that makes of our philosophical work the most vital and consequential of the disciplines, something of structural importance to our intellectual culture and foundational to our social worlds. This may seem optimistic or grandiose, but it appears to have been a standard view of the Second World War. Lord Keynes called Wittgenstein God, for God's sake. It's difficult to imagine someone like Thomas Piketty or Paul Krugman referring to, ironically or not, Zizek or Sloterdijk or Derrida or Meillassoux or Cornel West, for that matter, as capital G-O-D. It's difficult to say just what happened to philosophy, just where the esteem, or at least the self-regard, once so definitive of the discipline, went. One might turn, in a speculative vein, to the detonation of the atomic bomb during the aforementioned war. It's the menace and finality of that moment, the inescapable horror of a group of quiet men in ill-fitting waistcoats, changing for all time the fate of the human species, increasing perhaps infinitely the probability that the human race will be directly responsible for its own extinction. It was in the face of such a monstrous demonstration of the powers of the natural sciences that philosophy found itself in the midst of the worst identity crisis a discipline as such has faced. At the same time, we may see something in the heart of the discipline, something essential to the idea of philosophy that invites a certain authoritative crisis. As far back as 1763, Immanuel Kant was able honestly, somewhat plaintively, to write that, quote, claims to philosophical cognition generally enjoy the fate of opinion, are like the meteors, the brilliance of which is no guarantee of their endurance. Claims to philosophical cognition vanish, but mathematics endure. Close quote. For Kant, here and elsewhere, there's something about philosophical work which makes it especially or perhaps uniquely difficult, which leaves it especially vulnerable to hollow, superficial work and intellectual problems. In that same text, Kant takes pains to distinguish what he thinks the essence of mathematical cognition is from philosophical cognition. Here he claims that mathematics finds its concept through the synthesis of elements taken arbitrarily. Philosophy for Kant is a discipline that seeks the analysis of what is given. For this and related reasons, Kant seems downright eager to claim that the Leibnizian monadology is not philosophical in a certain sense. It does not provide us with what he called philosophical definitions. For Kant, it seems Leibniz's ideas are inventions, and invention is not, by Kant's light, the work of a philosopher. For Kant, it appears the work of philosophers is words, specifically and uniquely words to reason analytically about what is given. A contrasting view that leaps to mind is energetically expressed by the Deleuzian philosophy. For Deleuze, philosophy just is the creation of concepts. Philosophical thinking is the most creative possible intellectual enterprise, and on this, we should expect nothing from a philosophical text so much as a bevy of the kind of Leibnizian inventions that Kant seems those of. There's a question, more perhaps for the history of ideas than our direct concerns at the moment, as to how philosophy could make such a dramatic shift in its self-conception in just 200 years. Some might argue that it's Hegel, the speculative philosophy of that thinker, which stands between Kant and Deleuze. I think, and here we finally cut near to the theme of this paper, a more instructive mediating term can be found in the phenomenological philosophy of Edmund Husserl. It's through the Husserlian approach to philosophy in the most general sense that we're able to absorb the claim that philosophy is a form of creativity. We, of course, see creative moments in all of the great philosophical writers, from Plato and Aristotle and the entire Greek line to traditions which are periodically relegated to the sections of the library devoted to religion or mysticism. Here I'm thinking of Buddhist, Taoist, Islamic, Judaic, Christian. There's creativity in all of this, much philosophy too. But containing moments of creative thinking and expression is nothing like the same thing as having a meta-methodology which takes creativity to central discipline. The above claim that it's through phenomenology we are most readily able to see creative aspects of philosophical work that require some elaboration and defense. So, I'll take a case that's very close to me. It's the topic of my forthcoming book, Alterity and the Flint Water Crisis. I was born in Flint, Michigan, United States. I spent the first 12 years or so of my life there. The city has become somewhat famous or infamous for a crisis related to the water provided to Flint residents by the state and local governments. Flint is in Michigan, a state which is surrounded by some of the largest freshwater bodies on planet Earth. Flint and all Michigan cities should have access to a functionally infinite supply of potable water. For much of the 20th and 21st centuries, Flint, Michigan purchased its water from the city of Detroit, which has access to the waters of Lake Erie. In the period leading up to 2014, an emergency management regime was put in place by the state to improve the economic health of the state by cutting costs. One of the measures introduced involved a long-term partnership with Carrick-Nandi Water Authority, KWA, to build a new pipeline from the lake directly. While the pipeline was being built, Flint residents would get their water from a river running through town, aptly named the Flint River. The problem, which certainly should have been foreseen, was that the Flint River was not fit for drinking. Flint was an industrial town, hugely important to the auto industry of the 20th century. Flint is sort of like baby Detroit, like a smaller version of Detroit, Michigan, if you've heard of that. Flint is the sister city of Detroit. They were similar in their importance to 20th century automotive industry. The river was known to be contaminated, with many residents believing that hazardous chemicals from mercury to various forms of gunk were waiting in the brown water of the river. It turned out that the water treatment facility was not competently prepared to handle the switch to river water. The water was not treated with proper anti-corrosion additives, and the water ate through the scale lining, the interior of the lead pipes. Lead and other contaminants leaked into the water supply on a massive scale. It is not an exaggeration to say that the entire city was poisoned. Lead is a neurotoxic heavy metal that is responsible for developmental and cognitive disorders of many kinds. When introduced to the human body, it can cause or contribute to the development of a frighteningly long list of disorders, including premature birth, low birth weight, headaches, mood disorders, general cognitive impairment, including memory disorders, problems with hair and skin, vomiting, fatigue, hearing loss, seizures, death, and others. citizens of Flint complained almost immediately about the quality of the water after the switch. There were public demonstrations and YouTube videos of frustrated and horrified people holding glasses of yellow or brown water up for despite the public outcry, and despite the fact Flint residents were paying some of the highest fees for water service at the time, nothing was done. For well over a year, the state government tried to ignore or downplay the obvious contamination of the drinking water in the city. If it weren't for the work of Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha and researchers at Virginia Tech, the situation may have continued in that way indefinitely, or for the years required by the KWA pipe project. It's here that we begin to think of alterity as a macro-scale social relation. My question when writing was how such a complete disregard of the needs of a local population was possible at all. I was inspired by the work of Isaac Ariel Reed, who crafts the social theory with three subjects: rector, actor, other. Rectors and actors, for Reed, form long chain-like structures that constitute social projects. Others are on the outside, excluded from those projects and the social good they may represent. In much of Reed's work, he sees the other as coming in three types. These are the enemy, the scapegoat, the slave. Reed and I spoke about this at a conference in 2018, and I suggested to him that there was another form of other, appropriately described at this level, that we could call the invisible. My claim is that understanding anything about what happened in Flint requires an analysis and exploration of alterity as invisibility. But to perform such an exploration, way both sociologically and philosophically satisfying, requires a method both analytically precise and capable of inspiring new thoughts, a method given to creative expression. Also, this method should help us connect empathetically with the subject of study in such a way that the world they inhabit may be thematized, so as to avoid reflexive comparison to the world of the socially dominant group. We do not begin the world or the perspective, if you like, of the technocrat, bureaucrat, the politician, or the intellectual. Neither do we end there. The world of the subject of study is what interests us, and it is this we hope to bring to givenness. I've already shifted to the language of the phenomenological method. Task for sociology going forward, it seems to me, is to incorporate the best pure philosophy of our sociological work, such that we allow for the exploration of the expansive field, the complete horizon of possibility characterizing the social. Husserl himself recognized the linkages between phenomenological work and sociological investigation. In the Basic Problems of Phenomenology, Appendix 12, Husserl says, quote, "One must immerse oneself so deeply that one brings to givenness their interpretations, supposed experiences, their superstitious fantasies, by means of which they let themselves be influenced, let themselves be guided, attracted, or repelled. Real connections consist in this. Under given circumstances, such and such notions, etc., were understandably evoked in human beings, whereby such and such reactions were motivated in them, which in turn motivated their employment." The above quotations, and we'll get to the limitations of it. The above quotation functions as a guide for a thoroughgoing phenomenological sociology. Sociology becomes a practice of empathetic searching for motivating notions, motivated reactions, which become keys to understanding not only individual, but social development. This guide of sorts is, however, a flawed guide for reasons that matter a great deal to us, and which are not restricted to the brevity of the above passage. To understand the limitations of this quote, we need to look at the way he uses the term superstitious. Think of how it comports with the structure of phenomenological work and aims of the immersive sociology Husserl appears describing. How should a phenomenological sociologist know if an influential fantasy is superstitious? The related question is how phenomenologists may spot a fantasy, but the concept of a superstition fits uneasily into the phenomenological work for several reasons, most important of which is foundational to any attempt at an empathetic sociology. We can call it the epoche. The epoche enjoins us to put away terms like superstitious, perhaps indefinite, but at least until a huge amount of phenomenological work has been done. Superstition is a term best suited to what Husserl calls the naturalistic attitude, the attitude toward phenomena characteristic of the natural science. The phenomenological method, the epoche, tells us to think in a way totally different to that of the naturalist. We are to take the phenomena, including social phenomena, as if we know nothing about it, as if we are beginning once again, as if in a kind of second childhood. In this state, we do not identify strange or spiritual practices, superstitious. How we merely allow ourselves to be interested in them, investigating them as best we can on their own terms. From within the epoche, sociology should not speak of or write of superstitious beliefs, but of charms, spells, angels, devils, etc. This is extremely important. Perhaps more important, from within the epoche, the transcendental reduction takes acts and structures of consciousness as the target for analysis and description. All of this pure phenomenological work can give rise to attention when attempting to marry phenomenology and sociology. Sociology is at least on some level about concrete persons in concrete situations. Sociology must take into account neighborhoods and bicycles, soup recipes, melodic phrasing, marketplaces, and courts of law. Sociology is a concrete worldly discipline. Transcendental method may float too high above or hide too deeply in the foundations of experience to animate a sociology we can recognize as such. We also run the risk of unnecessarily exoticizing the subject of study. For my own case in Flint, Michigan, is it necessary to break with the natural attitude, start from the beginning, to bring the world of Flint residents during the water crisis kind of? Here's a question. To illustrate the need for this kind of phenomenological work, we can examine a concept of invisibility I developed, alterity in water crisis. The problem we recall was just how a people's basic needs could be so catastrophically disregarded. This has to do with what we called alterity as invisibility. In my pure phenomenological investigations, I found a notion of expectation, grounded in Husserl's mature genetic phenomenology, becoming increasingly important for my work. This concept, or function of consciousness, is called recoil in my work, but the name doesn't matter. What the concept of recoil is meant to evoke is a kind of expectational blindness founded in what Husserl calls pretension. For Husserl, a moment of the lived present has three temporal characteristics: a now moment, a long tail of retentions, and a long series of future-facing protensions. Protensions can be thought of as motivated expectations for what, quotes, for what will be intuited in the now moment for consciousness. These protensions are driven by motivated associations held in retention. My past experience influences my expectations for the future. Recoil is a kind of negative movement or block on protension that creates a specific kind of blindness with respect to a specific aspect of an object type. To think intuitively about this, we can imagine a jar of ink with a tightly closed lid, a jar like this. If one were to open the jar and unscrew the cap, one would expect either ink or air to be inside. One would not expect a human eyeball, or a little cylindrical beehive, or a tangle of worms, or a stack of gold coins to be inside. Recoil allows us to intuit startling phenomena in the moment, but doesn't allow for the sedimentation to affect the founding physicality. So, say that you found yourself in my apartment, this one, and you picked up one of my bottles of ink, and upon shaking the bottle, you hear the clinking of small metal objects. You investigate further and you find that the bottle is full of what appear to be Spanish doubloons, gold coins, and no ink at all. It's a good, upstanding person of pure and virtuous mind. You don't even think of stealing my bottle of coins. Instead, run out to the nearest stationery store and you buy all of the bottles of ink they have. You smash them on the ground in wild abandon because you now expect ink bottles to be filled with precious gold coins, or do you probably not? Probably you simply think of your host as an eccentric, maybe a crank, who gets his kicks stuffing currency in bottles of ink, and caught in a schizophrenic merger of numismatism and graphomania. The type ink bottle has not changed for you. You've merely added a type to your stock of types specific to the ink bottles in an apartment. Since I'm sharing screen, I can show you maybe a picture from roll. Okay, so if this is visible, this is a picture from the Bernal manuscripts, if you know, and it's kind of representation of internal time consciousness. It's the idea of it is that friends. The idea of it is that you have this horizontal line, and this horizontal line is now. Things below the line are in retention. Things above the line are in what Husserl calls protension. They are expected. So I see someone coming, or I see something strange on my visual horizon, and I haven't intuited it yet, but I have a kind of expectation, protension about it. And things above the line, Husserl gives a kind of prime, right? He just says the symbol is prime symbol. One way to think about recoil is to think that there are some aspects of an object to be intuited which cannot take this prime, which cannot be on the protensional side, the now moment. I simply do not expect them. And there's a kind of rigidity to this. There's a sort of maintenance of the type, which is founded in what I call. But the function of recoil is even more precise than that. The aspects of the object which are blocked for pretension may be specific to the object type, and it is just this tailoring aspect of recoil that has the most pernicious effects in our social worlds. Before I illustrate this last thing, I'll remind us that recoil is a concept that comes directly out of pure phenomenological analysis. I view it as a straightforward elaboration of Husserl's genetic phenomenology. One way of seeing this is to reflect upon the need for the stability of a type as the condition of possibility, typified experience. If types take on too protean a character, if they change too much, possibility of an experience guided by types dissolve. One is left with a world of constantly shifting materiality, or rather a hyletic flow out of which a materiality may not be constituted. Materiality is, at some level, dependent on the possibility of typification. The specific nature of the negative movement at the heart of recoil, can be illustrated by moving the investigation to the empirical level and examining a remark from one of my respondents in Flint, Michigan. This was I was going basically door to door in a neighborhood on the north side of Flint, which is historically impoverished and generally marginalized area of the city of Flint, Michigan. And I knocked on the door and we started talking about the water and And she began telling me about violence, a kind of generalized violence that she has experienced and that she expects from the city and in the city of Flint. At one point in our conversation, she said, "I just don't understand our people anyway." You know what I'm saying? We is the worst race in the world. We kill ourselves, we kill each other. I mean, it ain't no end to what colored people do in Flint. Close quote. Now, she's talking about Black people, about African American in the context of Flint. But you can see many strange things about this recoil. As I read, I'll talk about recoil. But there are many strange things about this remark. One is it's kind of the totality of it, the frankness of it. I mean, she did not know me, to be very clear. We're not friends. We'd never spoken before. This is something she's comfortable saying about our people. And I was taken aback. This was one of my first days in the field doing this research. But later on, I came to see it as characteristic of a certain way of speaking, a private way of speaking, which is within the group, within the family. Now, what does such a remark suggest? What are the implications? The respondent was talking about her own people as if there were some essence of the people negatively determined by its incomprehensibility. If we think about the implications of this statement, we see how it is haunted by an impossibility. Our people are the worst race in the world because we kill one another, because there is no end to the lawlessness and the violence. My interpretation of these remarks is that they suggest a kind of recoiling from possible futures in which, quote, colored people in Flint live in peace and dignity. The implications of recoil as a function of context exceed the kind of habits of thought indicative of what is often called internalized racism. My macro scale social theoretic claim is that recoil is intersubjectively constituted. And for that reason, it is partially constitutive of the social surround. Talk about that vocabulary. Recoil, or recoiling habits of thought, determine the kinds of issue or person that receives attention in our social lives. Recoiling habits of thought deform the Lebensumwelten, or life worlds, through which or in which our lives are lived. To conclude, we can return for a moment to the topic of creativity in philosophical work. For the Husserl of the Cartesian Meditations, program of phenomenological philosophy included not only the destructive or reductive work of the epoche and transcendental method, but also a constructive possibility at the heart of phenomenological work. Probably through its association with Eugen Fink, he was keen to say that there was a possibility of the phenomenological method of constructing concrete worlds, not only through their givenness, but through a constructive constitutional a priori. Here's a quote. Therefore, consequentially, progressing phenomenon constructs a priori, with a strictly intuitive essential necessity and universality on the one hand, forms of conceivable worlds, and on the other hand, conceivable worlds themselves. The limits set by all conceivable forms of being and by their system level. As an aside, I very much enjoy Husserl's reflexive caveating. What's most important here, from the Cartesian method, Most important here is that we see the phenomenology not only concerned with forms of world, but worlds themselves. It is also not only concerned with conceivable worlds as distinguished from concrete worlds. Husserl, we see the category of the concrete contained within the category of the conceivable, with constructive practice in phenomenology applicable both. A bit further down, Husserl calls phenomenology a concrete logic of being, or a universal concrete ontology. Eugen Fink goes on in the Sixth Meditation and later work to develop a meontic phenomenology that is, it appears to me, rather too indebted to Heidegger. My claim be that the constructive, and by extension, creative aspects of the phenomenological work that Husserl's Cartesian meditations imply can be read in his early analysis of concrete experience, the bringing to givenness of intersubjective states and empathetic experience, were from the logical investigations forward part of the phenomenological work. The degree to which constructive phenomenology deals with what cannot be given is not entirely clear. And it appears that a firm grasp of eidetics, categorical intuition, and other forms of synthesis allow for a constructive phenomenology, if there is to be such a thing, that will not be at pains to exclude the ontic dimension. It will similarly not be at pains to develop a Finkian two-level ontology of sky and earth, appears somewhat less universal in application than phenomenology developed. What we get in the Cartesian meditations is a shift toward new modalities of apodicticity, an explicit emphasis on phenomenology as a philosophy in search of new conceptions, new descriptions of concrete worlds, both worlds of possibility and actuality. This work includes analysis of being as such. What phenomenologists need to devote themselves to today, creative application of phenomenological methods, developing the broadest possible conception of the implications of the phenomenological work. For this, a kind of hermeneutics is needed, but perhaps not exactly the hermeneutics of Heidegger and Gadamer. What sociological work shows is that the epoche is needed, but an interpretive practice is also a supplement to move the phenomenological work from pure ground comprising modes of apodicticity and givenness to a kind of fertile space from which concepts of all possible application to concrete life are drawn. To understand alterity as invisibility, even to develop a sense that alterity as invisibility might be important, new ideas are needed. If philosophy is to have a place in the discussions that determine the course of our collective social futures, a blinkered insistence on anything like a Kantian analytic approach simply will not do. Moving toward Husserl, toward eidetics, toward genetic methodology, even toward the very late notions of a constructive phenomenology seem to be best available paths, well established, for bringing the profound beauty of philosophical work into conversation. Universal, give the name humanity. And I thank you very much for your kind attention.
So thank you very, very much, Professor Atkinson, for your conference and also for your generosity to share the screen with us, with your text that we could read directly. So we have a first question from Marcelo, and then I have also other questions, and you could just write the questions here no chat. Vocês podem escrever as questões no chat aqui entre nós, né? E a gente pode, enfim, né, colocar as questões ou traduzi-las também sem problema, né, para o professor Atkinson. Então, Marcelo, gostaria de formular a questão?
Yes. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to know how much you think that the way our culture separate life, classification, hierarchies, etc., contributes to this invisibility of humanity. How much the way of being human as indetermination is done by our culture. Thank you.
Sure. So it's a very difficult question. I think that in formulating an answer, I think that the most difficult thing is I don't know, and I will give a real answer to your question, but the first thing that I'll say is that I don't know that it's a question of how much, a degree or extent to which question, right? I think it is a how question, and I think that the system of categories that we use has many levels, and exploring it is fairly difficult. But we could, because we're here and we're talking, we could draw a distinction between pure linguistic categories and other ways of perceiving or experiencing the other. So I think that one of the problems for philosophy is that philosophy is obsessed with the analysis of linguistic categories and with linguistic thinking. So sociology as well is almost entirely a discipline that's concerned with language and uses of language. But I think that when we're talking about invisibility, especially the invisibility of certain social groups, many of the most important determinants are not linguistic in this sense. So no one has to tell a person like Governor Snyder, Governor of the state of Michigan, no one has to tell him, and he doesn't have to say out loud that African Americans aren't as important as other people. That's not in the language. It's not in the technocrats' language. It's not in the bureaucrats' language. It's not in the languages of any of those dominant groups. So if we want to get a handle on things, we're going to have to find categories and ways of speaking out about categories that aren't at the level of the use of the language. So that's part of what I'm trying to do by opening up the field of expectation and potential. So in Husserlian genetic phenomenology, we have this idea of habituation through motivated association. And this is very, very important. And it's very important to understand the degree to which that is not about the language used. The language is a big part of it, and you can spend 1,000 careers just looking at the language. It's not only about that. And if we're looking for the kind of most originary instance of the habits that give rise to invisibility at the social level, we're probably not going to find it. So to give you an example, there a lot of my friends who are just interesting women, but a lot of my friends who are feminists will tell you about interruption, about being interrupted. And this is you can see it. Just go to any conference and just separate in your mind for just a moment the people on stage are men, the people who are women, and then look at who's interrupted and how often. Just count. And it appears that no one has been instructed. It's not really a linguistic thing. It's just something that one is habituated to do. You're, in a sense, allowed to do it. If your interlocutor is a certain kind of person, right? There are many such examples. I think that Dieter Lohmar, great, phenomenologist. We saw, Fabio and I saw his retirement, has written very, very well about non-linguistic thinking. I think incorporating it into our phenomenology is really quite important, especially after the hermeneutic turn. We don't have to give up on hermeneutics, but we have to recall that there are non-linguistic modes of givenness, there are non-linguistic relations, and there is such a thing as non-linguistic thinking. Now, I think that at the level of linguistic categories, we still have a very serious problem. It's from the grammar of the language to the vocabulary of the language to modes of address, modes of respect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have practices that are firmly entrenched in the culture, which give rise to what is called invisibility. I think, though, we are not likely to make anything better, ameliorate anything, solely through the use of language, in the sense of policing other people's language and telling them what to say, in the sense of using particular kinds of descriptions or words for marginalized groups in terms of pronouns. I don't think that's enough. I think our work, if we want to make some kind of a social change, probably going to need to be more various than that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Atkinson. I have also two questions that I would like to ask you. The first one is more general. If you do you consider that you could use the recoil method to think about other social problems, for example, here in Brazil, poverty or homeless? Could we use this method for other kinds of social problems? This is a first one question, a more general question, but I've also another question about Alfred Schutz. What do you think about a possible application of Schutz theory in the methods you are building? For example, it could be interesting to explore maybe the concept of simultaneity and consociated contemporary, for example, for sharing a community of space and time, because there in this case of this water crisis, how are we relation happens or not happens? Is there a kind of rupture between different groups, and could we call this rupture a structural one, a structural rupture between these different groups, from for example, Hector and Nectar and other? Don't know if I was clear in my ask, but this is my two questions. A general one in this, and then this possible interpretation, this interpretation by Alfred Schutz.
So, thank you. They're both very big questions. So in order to respond to the question as to what I think the applicability of recoil as a function of consciousness would be, I hope that it's quite broadly applicable. But sort of time will tell. What I'm slightly more confident about is that the problem of invisibility, of social invisibility, is a problem for all of us. And it appears to me that that problem will become more and more pressing as we go forward. Unless there are rather large social changes, the trends all kind of point in one direction. They point into the direction of smaller and more powerful groups of elites determining the basic of life for larger and larger groups of persons. So I don't see. I would love to be corrected. I'd be very happy for someone to tell me that that's not what's happening, and that's not what's going to continue to happen. But I have no indications that we're moving in any other kind of direction. So having a method or even a language, something as kind of weak as the language for addressing the set of problems that go with those kinds of things is extremely important. Now, if my description of recoil as such has some kind of value, it's in drawing a distinction between what I call recoil and what is broadly called dissociation. So there's a whole, right, very voluminous literature on dissociation and dissociative disorders. And what I'm pointing to is not that, for several reasons, some of which are just technical, like phenomenological literature and so on, but which maybe most importantly right now have to do with temporalization. That gets to, gets to your second question, which is about Schutz. I read, I hope it's true, I read that Husserl offered to make Schutz his assistant, that he wanted to have him as an assistant, and Alfred just had other things to do. Decided he didn't want to be in that kind of maelstrom of Husserlian life. And I hope that's true. I think that the problem, it depends on which kind of time you're talking about. And I would need to review. But it depends on which level of temporality. So to take the case of recoil, I think that recoil is a feature of our experience as internal time consciousness, right? So at that level, I suppose that the other, what's produced by, the temporality I have, the intersubjective temporality I have when I'm speaking to or even looking at the other, may not have a kind of social political function as such. Right? We may not see this kind of alteration at that level. I don't know. I would have to think about it. But I do think that there is a kind of temporalization, a kind of objectivization of time, which is a part of the practice and discourse of the excluding power. So that's a little naughtier than it needs to be. I think that powerful people control the clocks, but they don't control the clock of the heart. They control the external clock, the objective clock. They control the rhythms of the workday, and increasingly they control rhythms of our after work experience, of our private time, of our recreational time, because of the algorithms by which we work, so on and so forth. So that the modes of exclusion that I'm talking about, which are constitutive of social projects, maybe all social projects, certainly projects of social domination, so on, they have a kind of temporalization, and I think that some analyses could be useful there. I think so. Husserl is very, very good here. What I think is really great in Schutz is this idea of a kind of stock of knowledges, right? And I think it accords very, very well with genetic method and various forms of habituation that we talk about in genetic technology. In terms of temporalization, I would hesitate because my focus in terms of recoil has to do with the internal consciousness of time. But I'm sure there's a lot to say there. I'm sure there are intersubjective determinations as well.
Thank you very much for your answer. Don't know, não sei se alguém teria alguma outra questão, algum ponto que gostaria de formular para o professor Atkinson. Podem se valer do chat, né? Também podem fazer a pergunta diretamente, sem problema, né? I have another question about how could we understand by Ricard these relationships historically? For example, in this situation, in the Flanders crisis, but in other situations, they could see and hear this invisibility. How could we understand and investigate these relationships historically? It could be do by Ricard also. What do you think about this historical problem of historical invisibility? For example, in this case of Flanders crisis, or there in other cases, how the historical problem could help us to answer some kinds of problem. For example, here in Brazil, we could investigate our historical problems and for example, to explain how favelas and communities were born. And I don't know if the historical view could help us to explain this invisibility in a concrete way.
So it's a very important question for anybody doing sociology. Sociologists are supposed to be historians of the present. So we have to find a way to get the concrete or the empirical. One of the things that I tried to do in my work is to make a simple outline for phenomenological sociology, but I think that a very similar outline could obtain for a phenomenological history. I think that Quentin Meillassoux, and after finitude, his problem of the archifossil is maybe less of a problem than a lot of people think it is. So the outline of that method is that we need to do pure phenomenological work, and pure phenomenological work sort of disregards some of the features of objective time, though it can discover objective time, it disregards these features in itself. And this would be the first step, right? And that's probably what Husserl would want us to do. But then we need a way to get out of that, because we stay within the field of phenomenological work, then we can't get to the concrete, can't get to the empirical. And for a sociologist, this is a serious problem, because you've got to go out into the street and talk to people. If you're that kind of sociologist, and I am. So there's something of, maybe even a stigma related to the actual experimentation, actual conversation with others. Philosophers are supposed to think, right? Especially phenomenologists. You read phenomenological texts, and not just Husserl, but others, and you see a lot of examples that are on desks. I used a desk example today with an ink bottle. You hear a lot about pens and pieces of paper and so on and so forth. We need to be able to talk about other things. So I think that there's a second phase of a phenomenological sociology where you interpret the work in such a way that you can bring it into the empirical. So instead of just talking about consciousness, I'm talking about a human consciousness, talking about what people think, how they feel, individual persons in an individual place. In order to take this interpretive step, we need a whole lot of machinery, and we need a certain amount of humility. Because while I'm doing phenomenology, if I'm doing it well, as probably people on the call know, I'm safe. There's a cocoon-like character to the phenomenological work. As long as I'm being honest and I'm doing my best to describe the phenomena as they appear to me, then I'm doing phenomenology. And no one can tell me that I've screwed up or I should have done something else for my life. Once we leave that very warm and peaceful and lovely cocoon, we end up in the world, and in the world things go haywire, misunderstand, interpret. So this step, this first step of interpretation, is fraught with peril, and we have to accept it. I want to talk about the. Then we can investigate. Step 3 is you can go and talk to people and do interviews, you can write about them, all kind of stuff. And after you do your investigation, you can make very large interpretations, what Isaac Ariel Reed calls maximal interpretations of everything that's gone before. And then you can bring all of that back into the epoche. And we can do imaginative variation on whole entire investigations, which take all of these steps into account, right? The original phenomenological work, the minimal interpretation, the empirical investigation, and the maximum interpretation. You bring all of that, my claim, you can bring all of that into the epoche, and you can do imaginative variation on it and talk about different forms of experience, which are there as possibilities because of the investigation already done. Okay. So I think that all of that is, properly speaking, phenomenological if we have a broad enough notion of what it is to do phenomenology. For historical work, I think that this is of the utmost importance, because a kind of simple, straightforward, counterfactual analysis of a historical period is not good enough on my view. It's probably not empathetic enough. It's probably not rich enough, and it's probably not well enough connected to our experience of the world in the present. The solution to that kind of a problem for historians, on my own kind of humble view, is that we begin with phenomenology. We begin with our experience of this very. And when we get to the empirical phase, our empirical investigation is just history, how people do history. So the major problem is you end up with a very large endeavor. You end up with this huge thing you have to do. And that's just the trouble you get when you try to behave philosophically. But I think that that's the only way. It has to be at least that difficult to marry phenomenology in the best sense of the term, with other disciplines.
Thank you very much for the answer. We have a last question from Rodrigo Cabra that's brought here in the chat. Hello, good afternoon. I don't know exactly if this question has anything to do with your presentation. However, this question of invisibility changes according to the times and the current politics. For example, Black Panthers, Black Lives Matter, especially in a context after Barack Obama as president. How do you see these moments, these different moments and pictures and their relationships? I think that the question here is about some other examples and possible transformations after some kinds of different contexts and political contexts.
So first of all, I thank the questioner very much. I think it's very appropriate question. I think it has a lot to do with the things I'm trying to talk about. Politics can be viewed as the fight for political contestation. Can be the examples that you give are I think especially good. So who were the Black Panthers? I mean, there are many ways of talking about the Black Panthers, like Fred Hampton. What were they trying to do? I think that it's very uncontroversial to say they were trying to be seen at all levels, from the most militant end of the activity of the Black Panther Party to organizing end of the Black Panther Party. Being seen was part of it. Increasingly, as communication technology develops, the fight for visibility becomes the fight for power and social systems. Through visibility. I think that it's obvious enough that it's almost not interesting to say this, right? That we're all fighting for visibility, but the forms of visibility do change, and communication technologies have a lot to do with that. Now, with respect to Barack Obama, so there's a section of my book. It's called Invisible Faces in High Places or something. And it's a very interesting question, what it really meant for Americans that Barack Obama became president of the States. It's something that we are not going to get to the bottom of here in the next few minutes, but it's a profound question. What did the American populace really experience when they found that this face, which is a face you're supposed to look away from, right, was the representative face of the American people? What does it mean? Well, in the context of the city of Flint, you just say one thing that it meant. That when people in Flint felt that they had been lied to, and that all political power was against them, it meant that you could send the president into the city. It meant that the president could call the assembled people who were shouting because they were being poisoned, infected by Legionella bacteria. He could call them a feisty crowd. He could use the word feisty. And that he could take a drink of water to, I guess, to show them that it was safe. Now, whether or not Barack Obama believed at that time, he actually took that sip of water, whether or not he believed the water was safe or not, I don't think is the issue. I think what is the issue is the function of such a kind of visibility in, broadly speaking, contemporary political system. I think that it functions in such a way as functions in a few different ways. First, it may function so as to allow people to become complacent about their own condition. May function in this way, and it's possible that political entrepreneurs would like it to function. But it also may function such that people become alienated from the concept of a kind, of belonging to a kind, right? This is very complex, right, and very, very difficult. But I think that what you'll find as certain categories come to dominate political life, categories divorced from identity, human identity as such, categories like money power and computational power and so on. As these categories begin to dominate political life, that representation, skin color, gender, representations of these things will either become hyper important or terribly unimportant. And what will determine that is probably, it seems to be at this time, is the degree to which people feel that the visibility of a member of their kind is representative of their own visibility. So that's not an incredibly good answer, but it's the beginning of an answer to this question. Yeah, there's a bit more to say.
So, thank you very, very much, Professor Atkinson, for your answer and for your conference too, and your generosity. Thank you very much for showing the importance of phenomenological attitude and how the phenomenological method can be applied in a social science, especially for the question of invisibility. So thank you very much for your time, for your generosity. We are very happy to be here in a virtual space, and we hope that we could maybe in the future meet again, maybe here in Brazil or in Europe, and we keep in contact. Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I hope to come see you in Brazil and hear some choro music or something. But I'm looking forward to it. Thank you, Fabio and Marcelo, very, very much for this opportunity. Thanks to everybody on the call.
Obrigado.